Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the American Chamber of Commerce here in Hong Kong, welcome to the 2016 China Conference. Before I start, I just wanted to take a moment to recognize Richard, William Lin, who is our Director of China Affairs, Mary Simpson, who is our Director of Events, and the entire Hong Kong AmCham staff for all the fantastic work and efforts to put together this conference today. Can we give them a round of applause? So this is our 5th year since we reinstated the China Conference, which provides a great platform to allow business leaders, experts, and scholars to share insights and experiences on doing business in China. Over the years, we have attracted many fabulous speakers to effectively address the issues of the day in this always dynamic market called China. As a result, the conference continues to grow, and this year we actually have a record number of participants, so we're very excited about that. On behalf of the Board of Governors and members, I would like to thank our distinguished speakers, our moderators and presenters, and the sponsors for their contributions to the program today. Today's theme is Managing Transition, Foreign Business in the New China, with topics such as navigating the old China and new China with economic sectors, working and competing with Chinese firms as they go global, Hong Kong and China financial reforms, and one of my favorites that I'm very interested in, megacities and regionalization, which is going on at a fast pace north of the border. I'm looking forward to gaining new perspectives and opportunities and the risks in this complex market. So please enjoy the presentations today and look forward to some great discussions. Now it is my honor and privilege to introduce our next speaker. As we all know, AmCham enjoys a close and enduring partnership with the U.S. consulate here in Hong Kong. This relationship would not exist without the strong leadership of the Consul General. The arrival of Consul General Kurt Tong just a few weeks ago, he's a newbie here today, continues the tradition of strong leadership at the Hong Kong U.S. consulate. Consul General Tong arrived directly from Washington, D.C., where he was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs at the State Department. Consul General Tong has extensive diplomatic experience in Asia with over 26 years at a variety of posts, including those in Beijing, Tokyo, Seoul, and Manila. He also served as U.S. Ambassador to APEC. Consul General Tong holds a BA from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University, and he is fluent in Mandarin and Japanese. So please join me in welcoming Consul General Tong to the stage.
Well, thank you, Walter, and fluency is in the eye of the beholder. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'd like to say thank you to Walter, also to Richard and his staff for putting on this superb event. I'd like to extend greetings to Commissioner Tong. I know that many of you are confused about since we have the same name, which of us is the Consul General, which is the Commissioner for the MFA. So I'm the Consul General, and Commissioner Tong is from the MFA. I have a very simple mission this morning, which is to congratulate all of you for being smart enough to come to this conference. There is truly an excellent lineup of speakers. My old friend Chris Johnson will be speaking. Professor Huang, a very famous man from Beijing, will be sharing his insights. 4 excellent panels. Clearly, you've come to the right place this morning. And so congratulations to all of you. I think this is a very important event, actually, for a couple of reasons. First of all, Hong Kong is clearly the right place to have a conference on China and its business environment. Not just because Hong Kong is such a pleasant place, and here we are in the beautiful Four Seasons looking out on the harbor. It's certainly a wonderful place to have a meeting, but also because Hong Kong is one of the most important cities in China. And its unique characteristics allow it to have a global and regional reach well beyond its population of 7 million. The second reason is that the questions that you'll be hearing about today and the debates you'll be witnessing are on extraordinarily important topics. The future direction of China's economic and political reform will have a very big impact, a dramatic impact on the rest of the world, first and foremost on Hong Kong. So certainly it's the right topic, and you are in the right place. The last thing I'd like to say is this is my first appearance before many of the members of the American Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong. And I take the responsibility of being the U.S. government's primary contact to work with all of you in exploring business opportunities extraordinarily seriously, and developing a strong relationship between the consulate and the American Chamber will be one of my highest priorities. So I very much look forward to finding ways that we can help you. And also, as was noted, I am 2 weeks old in this job, just a baby, and so I'm going to need your help as well as we go forward expanding this very, very important economic and people-to-people relationship between the United States and Hong Kong. So thank you again, Walter, for this opportunity to say hello, and I will get out of your way and on with this very interesting conference. Thank you.
It's now my pleasure to introduce the introducer of our keynote speaker, Chris Johnson. So I'd like to call to the stage our good friend and actually platinum sponsor from Thomson Reuters, Sanjeev Chatrath, Managing Director, Regional Head Asia Financial and Risk for Thomson Reuters. Sanjeev?
Thank you very much, Richard, for the kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. A few weeks, actually, after the events of 11th of August last year, there was a statement that was made by the Chancellor for the Exchequer for the UK, which grabbed actually a lot of headlines last year, when he said, standing in the Shanghai Exchange, that he was at the epicenter of the turbulence for the global financial markets. Who would have predicted that in less than a year, that tectonic plates would have shifted, and perhaps all of the UK would be close to an epicenter of a new turbulence for the global financial markets. And I want to make that point just to emphasize the kind of uncertainty that businesses nowadays are faced with, which seems to be coming from all different directions, whether it is about geopolitical uncertainties, uncertainty with regards to security concerns, or uncertainty more broadly around the reputational and operational risks that our organizations face. If you compound that with rising wave of increasing nationalism and uncertainty that creates, clearly there is a wealth of different challenges that are there for most of the countries and most of the corporations to navigate. Now, to do that in the second largest economy in the world, which has its own unique characteristics and undergoing structural changes, makes it doubly exciting. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to all get together and exchange ideas and perhaps some of the best practices around what are those challenges and how we can navigate those challenges more effectively, both for global companies that operate in China, as well as Chinese companies that are looking to go global. As the most trusted source of intelligent information, Thomson Reuters is proud of the role that we play in helping communities to navigate these uncertainties and actually finding trusted answers that they need to be more effective in their businesses. These intelligent answers are really a synthesis of human intelligence, industry expertise, and innovative technology. And our open platform enables these communities to come together, conduct businesses, and transact in a safe, effective, and efficient manner. We've done that for 100 years in more than 100 countries. And specifically in the case of the mainland, we've had a strong and sustained presence for more than 140 years. During this time, we've enabled communities across financial, legal, tax, and accounting businesses. So I'm really pleased that we have the opportunities to support and sponsor this particular event. I want to thank Richard and Walter for your leadership for the Chamber and the role that Chamber has been performing in leading and advocating for the business communities in this region. It is now my pleasure to welcome and introduce our keynote speaker, Chris Johnson. I had the opportunity to listen to Chris last year, and in some ways it kind of feels like deja vu, but in many ways not, given just the quantum of change that has happened over the last 12 months. When it comes to China, Chris is an absolute authority, given his track record and his background. He's had more than 2 decades of experience in China affairs, regularly advising and consulting the government, the White House, and the foreign affairs ministries. He's had opportunities to work with the CIA, which uniquely qualifies him to give us an insight around what may be happening geopolitically. He's presently based in Washington with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So please join me in welcoming Chris to the stage. Chris.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sanjeev. I appreciate that kind introduction. And I want to extend my deep appreciation to Richard and to Walter and the rest of the AmCham Hong Kong team when they reached out to me a couple months ago now, indicating that they'd like me to return. Of course, I immediately said yes, because I so enjoyed last year's conference and the opportunity to come and speak with you all. As Sanjeev pointed out, in many ways, today we'll be discussing a lot of the same issues we talked about last year. The situation, I would argue, has only become more complex in the year since we last got together. But we're also starting, I think, to see some pretty clear signs of how we can expect things to evolve in China. One of the challenges I think we all face in looking at this situation is that I think it's fair to say that in past administrations in China, certainly in the area of Jiang Zemin and also Hu Jintao, it didn't require a lot of insight or certainly not even classified intelligence to be able to have some sense of what was going on inside the system. Things seemed to be pretty predictable, roll along on sort of certain trajectory. Under Xi Jinping, this has obviously become much more difficult. The situation is much more opaque. The number of people who actually know what's going on is very small, and sometimes they don't even know what's going on. And so this creates a real challenge for all of us who are looking at the topic. I thought today I'd just provide some overview remarks. I know what a stickler Richard is for time, so I'm going to try to make sure that I come in on time on my remarks, and then would love to have some questions from the audience. The G20 is very topical, so I thought I would sort of start there with my assessment of how to look at that event, talk a little bit about Chinese internal politics and where we see that going with the Party Congress now rapidly approaching in the fall of next year. Maybe look a little bit at Chinese foreign policy and how to think about developments in the South China Sea, other areas, and then perhaps a little bit on our own election fund in the United States and how that's likely to impact the most important bilateral relationship in the world. On the G20, I think really the way to look at it is China got exactly what they wanted out of the meeting, which was an impressive show, an opportunity for them to be able to burnish the country's and particularly President Xi Jinping's credentials as a global power center on the world stage, for President Xi the opportunity to demonstrate his role as an emerging global leader, and not much in the way of real substance, which is exactly sort of how they wanted it. I think the government's assessment of how they're hosting, how China thinks about their hosting of the G20 was summed up very nicely in a very lengthy page 1 piece in People's Daily yesterday, in which their core assessment was that of China as a confident great power striding forth into the world. And I think this is very much the message that was meant to be conveyed with the G20. Obviously, they released a very long communique with lots of annexes and so on. In my assessment, I read through most of it, no single decision really stands out, but I would highlight a few areas where I think at least the potential for some significant progress was made. The first was the general agreement among the G20 participants to forge a comprehensive and integrated narrative for strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. So clearly a sign that all of the major world leaders understand the challenges in the global economy and some sense of a willingness to work cooperatively and in an integrated fashion to try to smooth out the difficulties that we're seeing in the global economy. The other major highlight probably in the US-China context obviously is the climate change agreement. This is something that both President Obama and President Xi have been working on together throughout their respective tenures, and now to formally accede to the Paris Agreement is certainly a major accomplishment and puts a lot of pressure on other major emitters to do the same. Obviously, the sort of effort to strengthen the global financial architecture, it's been a challenging year in terms of the turbulence that we saw in the Chinese markets last summer, and again at the beginning of this year. China, I think, did a very effective job in making sure that those discussions did not focus solely on China. And I think we saw this across the board in their hosting of the G20, this effort to not be blamed for a lot of these key structural problems in the global economy. We saw this particularly on the issue of overcapacity, where in my estimation, while they did not succeed with sort of their ultimate goal, which would be to keep all mention of overcapacity out of the communique, they did manage to have language that basically blamed a significant portion of it on weak global demand rather than China as the sort of purveyor of all of this overcapacity. And I think for folks in this room, perhaps the most important thing to take a look at is this notion of this sort of guiding principles for global investment policy making. This is very interesting. It does seem that we have an effort by the G20 now to try to create some rules of the road, if you will, for inbound investment, trying to create a level playing field among various players. And obviously, without saying it openly, the Chinese market is the one, that really is the focus. But, obviously also Chinese investment going into the United States, the various challenges that that's faced with the CFIUS process in the US, things of this nature. So I think net-net we should view the meeting as a success. There's a lot of work to be done, obviously. We have an important political transition, obviously, coming in the United States, and lots of disarray in Europe, as Sanjeev was mentioning in his remarks. And so I think we have to kind of wait for all this to settle out before we'll really see the next wave of momentum. But obviously the Chinese are quite happy with the results. Turning to the domestic politics in China, always an exciting thing to watch. Very complicated, obviously, with Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, who's up, who's down. There's a lot of speculation about what's happening. And I think, per my remark a few moments ago, this really highlights the issue of the opacity. We have all of us looking around at the various tea leaves. I'm struck just in the last few weeks, clearly the leadership did go for its annual summer beach barbecue and leadership discussions in Beidaihe. After that, we've seen some personnel moves in the provinces primarily, and it's striking the radically different assessments that are out there with regard to how to interpret those personnel changes. And I think that very much underscores the fact that real insight is very hard to find. I think what we can draw from that is that President Xi has a definitive plan for what he would like to see coming out of the Party Congress. I'll go into some detail on that in a few moments. And that basically the period between now and then, this is going to be the primary preoccupation. Obviously, the economy, also a major preoccupation. But I think on President Xi's agenda, when he wakes up in the morning, the upcoming Party Congress is kind of issues 1 through 10. He's a traditional Chinese leader, very much someone who thinks about the kind of classic axiom in Chinese politics, which is people first and then policy. And so making sure that he controls the incoming Politburo, and especially the Politburo Standing Committee, I think will be very important to him. Related to that, with all this emphasis kind of shifting over to the politics, I think it's quite striking to sort of recognize that really since Deng Xiaoping embarked on the reform and opening policies in the 1970s, China's leaders, except in very extreme circumstances where they thought the regime was threatened, all of the Tiananmen crackdown in 1989, they've generally been guided by sort of one characteristic, which is this abiding sense of pragmatism, which is focused on prioritizing growth and development in China's economy. And I think what's been striking just in the last several months that we've seen is that this sort of traditional touchstone that the leadership has long abided by is under challenge. And we're seeing that the politics in many ways are starting to displace that traditional economic pragmatism. And we see a lot of policy confusion, a lot of policy effects of this game that's going on, among the central leadership. And just to give you a few examples, this tussle that seems to be on again, off again between President Xi and his premier Li Keqiang, lots of speculation about the editorial that appeared in People's Daily on May 9th, commonly acknowledged as having been written by Liu He, Xi Jinping's sort of chief economic advisor, seemingly very critical of Premier Li's State Council policies. And again, other instances that we've seen where the premier seems to be increasingly denigrated. And the policy impact seems to be one where you have a guy in Premier Li who is, rightly or wrongly seen as sort of the reform guy in the Politburo Standing Committee, and yet in the first half of this year, seemingly advocating or being the chief advocate for opening all the stimulus taps in terms of government spending. And when talking to folks, how do you explain this? It really comes down to he knows he has to meet that growth target, because if he doesn't, it will give President Xi an opportunity, a reason, a justification to displace him as premier next year when we come to the party Congress. And so I think we'll continue to see elements of that. Another very striking feature of this sort of supremacy of the politics is that, traditionally, again, under Hu Jintao, under Jiang Zemin, one of the key sort of components or sort of guidelines that the leadership tended to follow was project an image of unity outside, no matter how disunited you are internally. And one of the key elements of that in watching them over the years is making sure that meetings that are supposed to take place on a certain cycle take place on that cycle, so that it's reassuring to people that everything's kind of moving along. And, in the classic analogy, while the duck's feet may be, rapidly paddling underneath the water, everything looks very smooth. What I find very striking is that, just over the summertime, two major meetings that we would usually see, one being the Central Financial Work Conference that did not occur, as it usually would around that time of the year, and the mid-year Central Economic Work Conference also did not seem to have occurred, which is quite striking and tells us that there's a lot of disagreement on policy behind the scenes. I think what's also striking is the impression that I get, though, that whereas, again, traditionally there's this emphasis on unity, President Xi seems quite comfortable with having some public telegraphing of disputes within the leadership. I think the May 9th editorial flagged that very carefully. Things just don't show up on page 1 of People's Daily like that for no reason. The method of transmission, frankly, was just as important as the message in that instance. And I think this plays to President Xi's sort of traditional political strategy, which is to intimidate his colleagues where he can, to push very aggressively, make them uncomfortable so that they will yield and make concessions to him. And largely, it seems to be working. You'll read a lot of analysis and assessment that talks about pushback from inside the Politburo on President Xi, but when I try to nail down some of my colleagues who hold this view as to who these individuals might be, I don't get any clear answers, which I think is very telling. Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign obviously continues to roll along, largely without slowing down. I find it very telling that the fall plenum, which will take place next month, will focus on implementation of these new discipline regulations. And this is Wang Qishan and his role as the party's top graft buster. And typically these plenums in this cycle, the 6th plenum, are about culture or about ideology. I find it very interesting that Xi Jinping's version of culture and ideology is anti-corruption work. So I think we can expect to see this continue very much through the party Congress process. And really the only major question is not, will there be more big timber, if you will, among the tigers falling, but who? And we'll have to wait and see who that'll be. I have some ideas. I'd be happy to share them in the Q&A period. And I think President Xi's strategy, emerging strategy for the party Congress is pretty clear. First of all, my sense is that if he gets his way, he will, in effect, rebuff a lot of the so-called norms or rules that they've been following in this last several cycles of turnover. And what do I mean by that? Well, typically mid-cycle like this in a leader's tenure, we would expect the successor to be identified at that sort of mid-cycle Congress. My sense is that if President Xi gets his way, that will not happen. That does not necessarily mean, as is often assessed, that he is declaring himself God King for life and will never go away. It just means that in the second part of his tenure, he feels he needs as much power as he can have to deliver, on the agenda that I think we all would agree that came out of the third plenum that really has largely stalled since that time in 2013. Second, I think we'll see him make an effort to probably make adjustments to either the size of the Politburo Standing Committee or its composition. We could see him make some efforts to beef up other party bodies, such as the party secretariat, to bring some new blood into the sort of transmission engine for the ultimate party Congress in 2022, where maybe he will, maybe he won't hand over the party secretariatship. I certainly don't think he's made that decision yet. But this is putting a lot of pressure on the system. Xi Jinping's so-called detractors, opponents, whatever you might want to call them, it strikes me that really their effort for next fall is to deny him a maximalist victory rather than try to constrain him. And I think that's very telling in what we've been seeing with the leadership changes that are already coming. Turning to the foreign policy, it seems to me that it's quite striking. President Xi, when he first came onto the stage, made major changes to China's foreign policy. The old Deng Xiaoping policy of bite and hide, as it's called, keeping a low profile internationally, focusing on domestic development. This was junked pretty early in Xi Jinping's tenure, and now we have this greater emphasis on activism, whatever that means. I think the Chinese Foreign Ministry is just as confused as the rest of us with regard to how they're supposed to be active internationally. But I do think we've seen a lot of changes in their behavior. Depending on how you look at it, this can be seen as having backfired. There's a lot of assessment out there that suggests that, well, if you look around among China's immediate neighbors, their relations with most of them are actually worse than they were before Xi Jinping arrived. The heavy push in the South China Sea, some of the other policies seem to have both irritated those relationships and also increased, if you will, the demand pull for U.S. security insurance, U.S. security presence. And so to some degree, you hear the phrase a lot of the time, scoring own goals, that Xi Jinping has been scoring own goals. My own view is maybe not. It's a little too early to assess the effectiveness of this policy. What we do see is the reality is prior to 2012, the Scarborough Shoal was controlled by the Philippines. Now it's controlled by China. There were no consequences of any kind for China in that action. And they're playing the long game. The way they look at it, they're trying to create maritime strategic depth on their periphery, which they haven't had for most of their history. And they're sending a message, I think, to the region and to the United States. We intend to operate in these areas with our military at times of our choosing, perhaps occasionally with impunity, and the rest of you have to accept that. And if you don't want to accept that, these rocks mean a lot more to us than they do to you. And so I think we will continue to see what we've been seeing, which is a slow and steady consolidation of China's control in the area. It is encouraging that we saw in the meetings in Laos here in the last few days some effort with ASEAN to refocus on the code of conduct to try to find some diplomatic solutions. I think that is clearly China's response to the ICJ ruling and how they're trying to manage it. You can argue that with some effectiveness, they were able to kind of blame the US and Japan at the meetings for being the troublemakers on this issue, and that they had consensus with ASEAN. But it's very difficult to square that with what we see, again, are signs of them getting ready to build more structures on Scarborough Shoal, maybe do some more reclamation. And this is going to be a huge challenge for whoever comes in as the next US president, because in my estimation, the Chinese have been very successful at coming up with a strategy whereby they walk right up to the line, which would trigger some kind of US formal response, but then they know to stop. And it's a very frustrating thing to try to deal with, because at the end of the day, senior US policymakers have to make decisions like, are we really going to go to war with a thermonuclear power over some rocks, as a senior US military official said a few years ago. It's a very, very challenging thing. My own sense is that if the US wants to dissuade Chinese sort of policies in this direction, because of that challenge, we may have to start thinking asymmetrically about policy responses and thinking about different areas in which we might want to signal our displeasure with China. And so let me conclude with a few observations on the U.S. presidential election and how that's likely to affect the relationship. Obviously, I think China's net assessment is that the relationship with the Obama administration, while occasionally challenging, has overall been reasonably good. I think there's been an emphasis on trying to cooperate in areas of global cooperation, global concern, the Iran nuclear program, climate change, areas like this. And we've been quite successful. I think the administration deserves a lot of credit for the advancements we've made with China. My own concern is that the underlying tensions in the relationship are now shifting from the sort of intractable security issues that are always there to the economic relationship, which has always been sort of, as President Xi said when he was vice president visiting the U.S., the ballast and the propeller of the relationship. And a lot of these tensions over market access, the things you all are experiencing in your efforts in China, are going to be a real focus and I think are going to come to the fore rather quickly. The impending sort of disaster, I think, that we're looking at on TPP creates real problems for U.S. influence out here. I think this is going to be a huge challenge sometimes, certainly on the Hill. When I go and meet with people down there, I don't get the impression that they understand the impact this will have if the U.S. Fails on TPP. I think the administration certainly understands this. They're making every effort, but it's not looking good. It's not looking good. And in many ways, what we see coming out of that is the biggest gift the U.S. could possibly give to China in terms of, I guess you could say, propaganda, which is to make the case, as they often try to do, the U.S. is about military and stirring up trouble in the region. We're about trade and growth. And so this is a real fundamental issue that we're going to have to work on. In terms of the candidates, I think the Chinese in some ways are just as perplexed as all of you as to what's happening in our political system. They don't understand Mr. Trump, I don't think, at all. It's been somewhat striking to me sometimes when I talk to folks there about how quickly they've kind of assessed this as a person they can do business with. I think this has much more to do with their fears about Mrs. Clinton than it does about their own assessment of Mr. Trump. It's really unfortunate that when they think of Mrs. Clinton, they sort of view her as reflexively anti-China. I had the great privilege to deal with her a fair amount when she was Secretary of State. Never got that impression. What I think is that she is a traditional foreign policy realist. And as I like to remind the Chinese, so is Xi Jinping. So in fact, they might actually get along quite well together if there's mutual understanding in the relationship. I think one of the challenges we face is how do we reboot our sort of methods of interaction. There's a real problem in the U.S.-China bilateral mechanism right now in that President Xi has put so much more emphasis for policymaking on the party instead of the sort of formal government bureaucracy. And so our traditional mechanisms for interaction through the foreign ministry, through things like the strategic and economic dialogue, are troubled. And so I think it's going to create some real need for some ingenuity and some unique thinking on how we might restructure some of those relationships, try to get at these advisors of President Xi who really do influence how he thinks. So let me stop there, and I'll be glad to take any questions from the audience. Thank you.
Okay, we're now, as we promised, interactive conference. We have time for some questions. All I do, request that you would stand and say who you are and what company, and then ask a question, not make a speech, okay? We want to get as many questions as possible. Can we start with you, Andrew?
Andrew Weir from KPMG. Obviously, you know me, Richard, by saying don't do a speech, so I'll be very brief. Managing the transition, Chris, is the theme. Two subsidiary points. There's been a big push, as you know, on the policy side to transition the Chinese economy from heavy state-led, heavy industry to a more service economy, more market-led, more shift from fixed investment as a proportion of GDP to consumption. Very interested in your reflections on the clunky machinery relating to that and what you're seeing. And then secondly, linked to the transition is this whole concept of free trade agreements. A lot of moving parts out in the global world, a lot of look at protectionism again in the global world. I'm very interested in your read on the Chinese philosophy towards how to handle these free trade agreement discussions moving forward, and what you think China's looking to achieve. Thank you.
Great. Fantastic questions. Thank you, Andrew. In terms of the machine on reform, I mean, I find it very striking that a lot of my sinological watching colleagues, a very common opinion is basically reform is dead already under Xi Jinping. We're not going to see any movement. Obviously, it's been disappointing, as I mentioned, since the third plenum. We've seen a lot of these things either be sort of stillborn or put aside. It's very challenging. And at times, the leadership seems to be just running around in a sort of higgledy-piggledy fashion, going from one topic to the next. They created this new central leading group on comprehensively deepening reform. Yes, they meet regularly, but they often seem to decide things that, frankly, for that level of leadership that's present in that body, shouldn't be being resolved by those guys. A recent one was talking about something in very minor detail in education policy, things like this. I think probably the best way to understand it, what I'm very focused on, is looking at this whole issue of supply-side reform and how they're dealing with that. It's been an interesting sort of narrative arc, if you will. And I think it says a lot also about how policymaking in China is being run under the Xi Jinping administration. Basically, supply side didn't exist prior to last October when Liu He, in a speech in Guangdong, raised it for the first time. He's clearly the progenitor of this idea. And then very quickly by the Central Economic Work Conference in December, this was the main theme coming out. And the sense I got was that the public message was very much, this is what supply side is. The private message, especially to local officials, was, look, the economy is decelerating a lot more than we expected. So we're going to pump up the spending, to get growth. You're going to have that opportunity, but you can't just spend the money. You have to work on supply side as well. And I would argue after the first quarter of 2016, when they did sort of an assessment, they realized the localities had done a great job of spending the money and hadn't done anything on supply side. And the May 9th editorial, I think, very much fits in there. It was basically a last warning, if you will, to the local cadre. We're serious, get serious. This is the issue. And I think, frankly, my own observation, just from tooling around in a lot of these areas where this is a problem, there's a lot more going on the ground than sort of Western media and commentariat sort of narrative would suggest. They are very serious, I think, about this effort. They're making real efforts. One of the challenges that people tend to reflect back on the golden era of Zhu Rongji and his toughness and going after state-owned enterprises and so on. Totally different animal, at that time. They were shutting down moribund textile factories on the margins of major municipalities, Beijing, Shanghai. I mean, they were very blessed. They closed those factories, sold the land at 30x or whatever, used that money to help handle the transition. For these steel and coal areas, these are in, at best, second-tier cities. And so it's a full-on government expenditure problem, and it's massive. What I find striking is that there was some speculation in the Western media that this dispute, if you will, between President Xi and Premier Li was not just about politics, but was policy. And one of the areas they were disagreeing over was the supply side. I find it very interesting that almost immediately after it appeared that the Beidai He Leadership Conference ended, Premier Li holds an executive state council meeting where the emphasis is supply side, supply side, supply side. So I think we should look and watch that very carefully going in to the end of the year. On the broader reform package, they're not going to tell us very much between now and the Party Congress. That's my assessment. They'll keep juicing the system. We see now that there's a big shift that's obvious from emphasizing monetary policy tools to fiscal spending, for the second half of this year. And I expect that to continue. And we'll just have to satisfy ourselves with the fact that Xi's intentions on reform are not clear. What I do think is that it will become very clear shortly after the Party Congress. If he has a big win or a modest win even, as I expect, the appointments will tell us a lot. And I think expectation among all of you after several years of frustration will be now's the time. So they'll face a lot of pressure to move forward. And sorry, the second question again was? Free trade, yeah. I think, look, again, with the U.S. struggling with the TPP piece, they're going to be pushing this very hard. It's been interesting to watch the South Korea, Japan, China effort, making some progress again. RCEP is obviously there. I think they see a real opportunity to press ahead on this and sign as many agreements as they can. Mm-hmm.
Next question. Over here.
Catherine Diott from the Heinrich Foundation. Could you tell us a little about how you think the Standing Committee and Xi himself is thinking about foreign direct investment?
Mm-hmm.
Many of the people in this room represent foreign direct investors, so we'd like to know what the sentiment is in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think it's a challenging environment for foreign direct investment. I think we've seen so far under Xi Jinping's leadership a sort of shift in mindset, if you will, to some degree, which is the thought that in the past the emphasis was we love foreign direct investment, we'll take as much of it as we can get. It's helpful to us, we don't even know how to run the basics, so please educate, so on. There's been a pretty significant mindset shift, I think, among the top leadership, and Xi Jinping is Exhibit A, where now they basically believe foreign firms need China's market much more than they need that FDI. And it's a simple statement, but if you think about its implications, it suggests that the Chinese government now sort of sees that they've got tremendous headroom, if you will, to push foreign companies to make concessions and so on before a given company will leave that market because it's so significant. I think we're seeing this across the board in the IT sector, heavy pressure obviously on US and other foreign firms, in other sectors, pharmaceutical, autos, the whole range. It does not mean that it's time to leave the China market. There's still tremendous opportunity there, but I think it's important for firms thinking about their investment strategies in China to go in with their eyes open, to understand that in many ways the end state for China is I want to be you, MNC X. And so it's about designing a strategy whereby knowing that end state, you seek to maximize your opportunity in the market. One thing that's been very interesting and I think is encouraging for everyone in this audience is how several firms have sought to sort of look at the direction that the Chinese policy is going and try to align themselves, through finding a niche, if you will, to place themselves in the direction of aligning with policy. And I think this is something that's very important for President Xi. When he thinks about a foreign company, the two main questions he asks are, does this enterprise understand the challenges that I'm facing domestically and the difficulty of this transition that Andrew was talking about? And that's fairly easy. I mean, you read the papers, you can kind of have an assessment. But the second one is, what are they doing to align themselves with these policies, obviously within the constraints of their corporate interests? I think this is a very, very important dynamic when he thinks about foreign firms, and we're likely to see that continue.
Next question. Michael.
Michael Kleinbeiner from BlackRock. Just to sort of ask a follow-up question at Andrew. When you think about the range of outcomes that might come from the Party Congress, it seems like a very wide range. If you were to handicap the sort of higher probability outcomes, can you kind of paint a picture of what China might look like in, say, January 2018?
Sure. I do think it's something of a crapshoot. I mean, the intentions are very clear. I think the way I try to frame it is we're going to have a contest between what President Xi wants to achieve and what the system, so-called system, will allow him to achieve. And how much is the system a constraint on what he's trying to do? And I think there's a lot of divergent views in the watching community as to what that's all about. In other words, as he tries to press a pretty ambitious agenda to have a major win at that meeting, to what degree will he be allowed to get away with this? And I think it has to do with his desire, as I mentioned earlier, to perhaps break some pretty big dishes, the issue of identifying the successor. My own sense is he might try to monkey around with the so-called age restrictions. A lot of these sort of policies that have been sacrosanct, really, for the last several party congresses. Looking at it in a historical context, what he seems to be doing is following a pattern that was very similar to that followed by Deng Xiaoping in the period from sort of 1982 to 1985, post-Cultural Revolution. He had a lot of, old Maoist folks and so on, military, still on the Politburo. He went out, he identified a lot of young leaders, the Li Ruihuans, the Chao Shurs, people like that, put them on the secretariat of the party in the 1985 Work Conference, and then brought them up to the Politburo in senior positions in 1987. My understanding is, President Xi has talked about this experience a lot in internal speeches and so on. So the sense I have is that he's kind of headed in that direction. If he wants to sort of put the succession, if you will, notion on pause, I think he has kind of two choices. One is to shrink the size of the Politburo Standing Committee again from its current 7 to 5 or something along those lines, to reduce the number of seats he has to fill and therefore have less pressure to identify these successors. I think the other opportunity would be to keep it at 7 and then kind of do a reboot of what they did at the 18th Party Congress, which would be to select a bunch of people who've got one more round in them, who will be largely obedient to him. And so things like this recent turnover in Xinjiang, right, where a Politburo member, Zhang Chunxian, has been replaced. We don't know what position he's going to go into, probably somewhere in Beijing. Maybe he's headed for the Standing Committee. Maybe it's a sinecure. There's a lot of this sort of speculation going on. But if I had to wrap it up in a sentence, I'd say if Xi Jinping gets his way, the results will be disruptive. And I think will surprise a lot of people who aren't, watching it too closely and or who think these rules that they've been following for a long time will remain in effect.
We have time for one more question. Yes, right here.
My name is Annabelle Allen from ADVA Recruitment. I'd like to ask about how you see the Chinese government's approach to the pollution problems fitting in with the push for economic growth and development.
It's a tough issue. My sense is, though, that there's a level of seriousness, really, that we haven't seen before. We just completed a major study on the 13th five-year plan at CSIS, and one of the things that really struck us in our analysis was the number of mandatory targets in the 13th five-year plan that focus on this issue. The targets are one thing. These mandatory targets are ones where they really do try to hit the mark. And I think this is a tremendous area of opportunity for folks sitting in this room when it comes to environmentally friendly technologies, green technologies. They're just going to go gangbusters on this. And we're only seeing just the beginning now. The reality is that the ministries, the localities are just now putting into place their own five-year plans to kind of align with the central 13th five-year plan. And this is going to be a huge point of emphasis. My own assessment is that the trigger here, if you will, is that pollution has gone from, and air quality, food safety, all these issues, they've gone from sort of scientific problems, if you will, or irritants to social stability problems. The middle class in China is very concerned about these issues. And the leadership tends to act when they see social stability problems. One thing that's been interesting, something the leadership, I think, has done very well, going back to Jiang Zemin's tenure with the effort to include private entrepreneurs into the party. They've been very smart about co-opting that rising middle class and keeping them inside the tent, if you will. I think in the mid to late Hu Jintao period, with things like the Arab Spring, these issues, their focus shifted a bit to these more diffuse social stability threats, Jasmine Revolution, these sort of things. And I think they kind of took their eye off the ball of keeping that middle class happy. I think under Xi Jinping, we've seen a return to that emphasis and those policies, and environment's going to be a huge one in that area.
You please join me in thanking Chris for a great opening.